You guys may need to bear with me a minute. I'm getting more emotional the older I get. Turning out to be more like my dad and my mom, I think. But it's an honor to come up here and speak today. You know, it's been said that a loss of a child is the most devastating experience a parent can face. The loss of a young child will only magnify that devastation. Because you not only mourn the loss of the child, but it shatters the dreams and the hope that you have for the young child. It's no different with Bryer and this loss that we're experiencing. I've already found myself asking the questions why this has happened. I ask myself, how could things have been different? What else more could have been done? And then I'm stopped in my tracks, and I'm reminded that Bryer's life was exactly what God intended it to be. He doesn't make mistakes. His life was unique, to say the least. See, Bryer was nearly 11 months old, and in those 11 months, very few days were without serious intervention. You couldn't really describe what a normal day was like for Bryer, Carrie, and Justin, because the only normal thing about it was nothing was ever normal. Through many inconclusive tests, many different treatment plans, some false hopes, shattered dreams, and a roller coaster of emotions, there was one consistent theme that began to emerge. In fact, if you were going to write a story about Bryer's life, he may not even be the main character. See, when a person really begins to look at the life that he had, they're going to begin to see that he had his greatest impact on the people around him. Bryer's story is powerful, and his message is eternal. If I was writing a story about Bryer's life, there would certainly be a lot of characters. There's obviously a sister and a brother. There's aunts and uncles, grandparents, cousins, lots of friends, extended family, churches, and multiple people who prayed on his behalf. But I would have to say that the stars of Bryer's story would be Carrie and Justin. I think Bryer would agree. See, I think God used Bryer to take Carrie and Justin on a journey that's lasted well over a year. From the first time the first questions emerged when Bryer was in Carrie's belly, to the day he took his last breath, he was in her arms. God used Bryer to strengthen the faith that Carrie and Justin became dependent upon. The word faith gets thrown around a lot, especially when we're in churches or religious settings like this. It's used in everyday language. But what's the word really mean? I don't think you really understand the meaning of faith until you have to draw upon it. For Carrie and Justin, faith is having a complete confidence in something greater than themselves. For them, that faith was and is in a God whom they've placed their life with many years ago. Their faith allows them to see the unseen. It allows them to believe the unbelievable. Their faith is their foundation of hope. But Carrie and Justin will tell you that learning to let their faith sustain them has not been an easy task. Trying to have faith when not one doctor could really give them a definitive diagnosis or a definitive reason why their 5.5-month-old son spent that long in the NICU. There were certainly frustrations when medical teams were at complete odds on how to treat Bryer or what the next course of therapy should be. Faith was tested when one parent would spend a 12-hour shift at the hospital, supporting and fighting for a child who couldn't do it himself. while the other was at home trying to figure out how to keep a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old engaged into the family. One parent would spend the day at the zoo, while the other watched an infant son on a breathing machine, being fed through a tube through his stomach. Then they would switch, seeing each other just long enough to update the other on how the day was, make plans for Remy and Sandra the next day, who was going to take Remy to school, who was going to pick up Sandra, and so on. Faith was certainly tested. But along the way, God continued to work the way that He always does. Sometimes encouragement came through songs, many of the ones we've heard today and sang today. Songs they would sing at Bryer, ones they would hear on the radio, or sometimes just God would put one in your head and they would sing it. These were all signs from God that they were not alone, that allowed them to have confidence in their faith. See, God continued to work through the situation in a lot of different ways, always sustaining His faith, sustaining their faith. He placed very special nurses and doctors in their lives at particular times when their faith needed encouragement. Not only were they encouraged by how these people cared for their son, but their spiritual encouragement to them was felt as well. There's a story in the Old Testament about a king named David, and he had similar experiences to Carrie and Justin, and the fact that he had a newborn son who was very ill at birth. In fact, he was ill enough that it was known he was probably not going to live long. King David, as powerful as he was, felt completely helpless. Began to do the only thing he knew of, and that was cast prayers up to God to help heal his son. For days he did nothing but pray. He fasted. He would not eat. He did not sleep. He rolled on the ground, begging to God to hear and answer his prayers. His servants tried to encourage him. They brought him food, but he would not eat. They brought him clean clothes, but he never changed. This went on for 7 days until King David finally sensed that God had taken his son home. When David asked his servants if the child had died, and they confirmed what he already knew. But then David did something that surprised everybody. He got up off the ground and dusted himself off. He went and changed to put on clean clothes. And he went to the house of God and he worshipped. Like King David, it was important for Carrie and Justin to incorporate worship songs into Bryer's service today. That's why we opened the service singing like we did. Some of you may ask the question, why? Just as King David's servants did. Asking King David, why would you go to the house of God and worship after you have cast your prayers to Him relentlessly, asking for intervention, asking for healing, and only when your son dies you go to the house of God and you worship? See, David's response revealed something to his servants and to all who knew him. His faith. His response was, I will go see my son again in heaven. David trusted God for his own salvation and knew that his faith would be reunited. Through his faith, he would be reunited with his son again in heaven. It's that same hope in heaven that's God carrying Justin through many more difficult situations with Bryer. Through this entire time, Carrie and Justin continued to diligently ask God to move in a big way. They were specific in their requests for complete healing and medical clarity. They, like King David, could hardly eat and poured 100% of everything they had to his care. During this time of requesting God's intervention and healing for their young son, their faith and dependence grew stronger upon him. Over the course of time, there always seemed to be a small victory with Bryer's health, but it was usually followed up by a major setback. And in Bryer's case, a major setback was always major. Oftentimes, the result of a simple virus that a healthy child would just simply shake off They would overtake Bryer, drive him back into Children's for usually a long period of time. It was during one of his last admissions to Children's that Carrie and Justin finally broke. Nearly unable to mentally and physically move forward, they cast their prayers again to God. And in talking to Carrie, she asked God to move in a big way. She said, God, if you are not going to move in a big way, move Justin and I where we need to be. They both understood that there was so much more for Bryer than the life that he was leading. Constantly hooked up to medical equipment, now experiencing some seizures. It was just a lot to handle. But at that point in time, Carrie and Justin's faith turned to hope. It was also at that time that God revealed answers to Carrie and Justin about Bryer that no medical test was able to ever explain. I tell you all of that to get to this point. Carrie and Justin's faith was built and strengthened through Bryer and his story. That was never more obvious than in Bryer's final days, when God began to slowly reveal to them that his plan for Bryer was to lead him to heaven. Months were filled with so much anxiety and anxiousness. And so many questions just swirling in your head. What is the diagnosis? What is the treatment plan? What testing to be run? What will they show? What are they looking for? Why does he have a fever? Where is his infection? Is it a viral infection? What is the benefit of this therapy? What is the drawback of this medication? Constantly searching, constantly wondering what it was they were up against. This was constant for 10.5 months, until finally God moved in his big way. He simply spoke to them. He said, "Stop, be still, and know that I'm God. Trust me just as you trust in me. Never will I leave you, never will I forsake you. Trust in my plan for Bryer." There are times to speak, and there are times to be assertive and take action. But sometimes it's important just to humbly sit back and silently reflect on God's presence. That's what Carrie and Justin did. See, after 10.5 months of looking for answers from doctors, questioning the results of tests, and hopelessly wondering what the next day would have in store for them, God began to take charge of Bryer's care. He rewarded Carrie and Justin's faithfulness with an experience over the final couple days of Bryer's life that only he could provide. His presence was with them during this time, and it was felt by many of us who were around. This is just a part of what Bryer's story and legacy will be, but it's an important part. A young mother and father relentlessly fighting for a young child, all the while God used that same child to reveal a plan and also increase their faith. I know the story and his plan for them are far from over. I'm certainly excited to see how God will unfold the rest of it. I realized something in the last week or so as I was preparing to speak and looking back on this entire timeline of events with Bryer and Carrie and Justin and the family. And one thing that I saw, and it's very evident when you look back, is that God delivered everything that Carrie and Justin has needed. From the beginning, through prayer and through faithfulness, he never left their side. And in looking back, that's obvious. He encouraged them with an overwhelming amount of love and support that they've received even in these most recent days. God has delivered. While thinking about how good God is, it hit me. See, God knows firsthand exactly what Carrie and Justin need, because he too has experienced the death of a son.